Thank you all for joining today's webinar hosted by the Secure Community Network and Jewish Federations of North America on the Nonprofit Security Grant Program for 2021. Grateful for everyone joining us today. A few notes before we get started. This is being recorded and the recording will be made available to all participants after it concludes, as well as all referenced materials and resources that we'll discuss throughout the next several minutes with our many partners who you can see up on the screen right now. If you have any questions throughout, we will do our best to address. Please drop them into the Q&A, or the chat is also open for those questions. Again, thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to SCN National Director and CEO, Michael Masters.
Good afternoon. The Secure Community Network, or SCN, is the official safety and security organization for the Jewish community, is honored to co-host this webinar with our partner, the Jewish Federations of North America. We'd also like to recognize the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. Our mission and that of the Security Director Network is not merely to serve as a liaison with law enforcement or assist communities and organizations with policies and procedures, assessments, physical security solutions, or trainings, however. It's to ensure Jewish life and culture can not only exist, but flourish. We on this webinar know that many would like to see that goal fail. We have faced 4 deadly attacks in our community since October 2018. Over 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes were targeted at our community in 2019, a 14% increase from the year before. 1 year later, and while COVID-19 closed many of our community institutions, it hasn't stopped those who hate us or wish us harm. In coordination with federal law enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security, SCN assesses that far from current conditions decreasing the likelihood of an incident, stressors from the pandemic may increase them. This means that as we open our facilities and communities, we have to be more committed to safety and security. Between local federations, national organizations, our partners at JFNA and the conference, our community is working more closely now than ever before to address the intertwined issues of hate, extremism, anti-Semitism, safety, and security. That's essential. In 2017, less than 8% of Jewish communities had a dedicated security professional director. Today, more than 65% of communities have access to a professional security resource. We are seeing increased investments at the local level and national level, and a push to ensure a best practice approach. One of the greatest strengths of our community is its diversity. When it comes to security, though, we have to take a comprehensive, consistent, best practice approach, not a siloed one. For one of our other strengths is that we come together as a collective. In security, coordination is not a condition of success, it's a requirement for it. And every community and institution, regardless of size, affiliation, or location, should be safe and secure. And while we're making progress, we have more work to do and more investments to make. We also have to take advantage of the opportunities before us. One of the key opportunities is the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. NSGP funding is now protecting more communities in more places. Thanks to our collaborative work, recent changes allow organizations in non-urban areas to take advantage of the program. From attacks in Overland Park, Kansas to Poway, California, as the threat has changed, this has been an important expansion. It's been led by JFNA. Today, NSGP funds can now be used to support planning, exercising, and training for all of us. For organizations that couldn't support such training prior, this can literally be the difference between life and death. When you apply, please consider not just physical security enhancements, but including funds for planning and training. It's our goal that every Jewish organization is informed, positioned, and able to apply for and use these funds in an efficient and effective manner. SCN and JFNA, in coordination with federations around the country, are working together to increase our support to communities and organizations, from increased webinars to more resources. SCN has an updated assessment form that organizations can complete on their own. We also have an updated services guide that can assist organizations in applying for money to support best practice training and exercises. These resources are on our website and will be continually updated. We'll also be dedicating personnel, additional time and energy to supporting the community through the process. Please note that we anticipate that the grant will be announced in mid to late February. Historically, it will close 6 to 8 weeks later, but that doesn't mean you should only take 6 weeks to complete the application. We encourage people to work on this all year long. And if you haven't started working on it, now's the time. NSGP funding has made our community more safe and secure. It's placed electronic locks on exterior doors of JCCs, panic buttons in schools, and provided training to synagogues. but it can only do this if we take advantage of the opportunity. Let us work together to make sure we're not an easy target, but a prepared and vigilant community. It's now my pleasure to introduce a leader of our community who comes from a community that has been at the forefront of working to address security issues for well over 20 years. Keith Libman, member of JFNA's Domestic Policy and Government Affairs Council and chairman of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland's Security Committee. Keith?
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. The last time I peeked at our counter, we're well over 700 participants today, so it's great to have so many folks from around the country participating with us. More than 19 years ago, in the aftermath of 9/11, JFNA urged Congress that as it further deliberated on issues surrounding homeland defense, and in particular focused on how best to secure local communities, it should include consideration of the security needs of the nonprofit sector. Since then, JFNA has led the advocacy efforts behind Congress's establishing the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Since 2005, nearly $600 million has been appropriated, including $180 million this year. These grants will support target hardening and other physical security enhancements and activities to nonprofit organizations that are at high risk of terrorist attack and violent homegrown extremism. I have seen firsthand in Cleveland how participation in these grant programs has not only provided incredibly necessary physical improvements to our community organizations, but also how they have helped lift the awareness of security needs and precautions throughout the community. Today's webinar, jointly hosted by the Jewish Federations of North America and the Secure Community Network, provides a critical opportunity for all interested communities and organizations across the country to avail themselves of this opportunity. With that, I'm happy to turn your attention to my colleagues who will talk you through the nuances of the grant application.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Michael, and welcome. It's good to see many of you again and appreciate the participation. As Michael mentioned, this is an ongoing series of webinars, our third in the series. We will be scheduling additional ones in the future as we drill further down from the broader perspectives we'll be presenting today into things such as the investment justification, the application, and working further to provide guidance in the future. Glad to be with my colleague Rob Goldberg again today, and we'll be running through the presentation for the next about 45-50 minutes. The team will be answering questions along the way, so please continue to put Q&A in the chat and we will answer them throughout. And as much time allows at the end, we will continue to answer questions. Right off the bat, I want to just re-announce, I've done this in the past, but certainly guidance is not coming out till Michael mentioned until mid to late February. So this call is very preliminary in nature, but it is based on, our assessment and guidance from, past cycles and historical data, most closely aligned with the last 2020 fiscal year grant cycle, both in process and application. It is, as we know, important to closely follow and track the updates and guidance and continue to submit and ask questions along the way, both to SCN and certainly JFNA's DC office under Rob Goldberg's leadership on the grant side of things. And then lastly, you'll hear this often, as we mentioned, SAA, State Administrative Agency, always check on local requirements and deadlines, which may be different at the state level based on when those SAAs are submitting applications to FEMA and any other state level adjustments or modifications that are required. If you do not already know your grant's point of contact at your state administrative agency at the state level, we suggest you do that immediately. Next slide, please. Just want to take a minute to really just go over, as Keith mentioned, this program has been around for over 15 years now and talked about the aggregate amount of funding. This is just a snapshot of historical funding since the program's inception in 2005. We've seen a steady increase in dollar amount, both in numbers of applications. It is a competitive process, as you all know, and we're seeing, those numbers increase year over year. Based on the congressional funding and appropriations, as we now know, the FY21 funding has doubled from 100 to 180 million, from 90 million in the last fiscal year of 2020. This year, that breakdown is going to be an even split between both programs, the UASI, non-UASI NSGPS program, which Rob and I will detail further in the slides, for those located outside of designated UASI urban areas. Last year was the highest total amount in the history of the program until this year, also with the largest number of applicants, as you can see on the slide. We had 2175 applications with nearly 1,137 awards across the program, which represented last year a 52% award rate, which significantly higher than in past years, where typically we've seen somewhere around 30 to 40% of applications receiving awards. So that's positive news. With the increase in dollars, there'll be increase in applications, but certainly a competitive process and opportunity for significant funding in FY21. Next slide, please. So briefly, what does the program seek to do? We've looked at it historically in the past, dozen years, and it's strictly related to physical security and authorized equipment list from its origin and outset, because primarily the goal with the impetus of the program was really physical target hardening and eligibility. And the purpose of the program is to protect nonprofits deemed at high risk of terrorist attack. Obviously, that's expanded in several past years. As I mentioned in our last briefing, a lot of that's driven by the changes in threat dynamics and perspectives that we've seen more broadly from, post 9/11 Islamist overseas attacks, and really including that preparedness planning and development of EOPs and EAPs, emergency operation plan, emergency action plans that Michael noted in his opening remarks. We have a real opportunity to add in training and related activities, in addition to funding some of those physical security enhancements that were the original impetus of the program. Some other allowable costs for contracted security personnel, obviously those are limited in scope and not the primary purpose of the program, and Rob will discuss some of those concerns and pitfalls later in the program. But ultimately, the goal is to really harden facilities and create a holistic security program. And we could do that under this grant program between physical security hardening, preparedness planning, training, and exercises, which all fits into the scope of the program. As we get into the application too, it's important to really think through, how does your organization fit within the broader community response? You may be looking at the four walls of your building when you're doing an assessment and thinking about protective security measures, but really is important to think through that broader whole community approach. This focus really largely emerged, after 2005, when we saw the impact of Hurricane Katrina, and really how to better integrate nonprofits, FBOs, and social service organizations into that broader and collective community response, which FEMA denotes as a whole community approach, and aligns with the natural preparedness goal and frameworks. More on this later, but what is really thinking about it from the impact, what is the impact of the facility or the consequences to your facility and the community from a loss or partial loss of your facility? And it's critical to think through how that fits into the broader picture beyond what you're looking at within the four walls of your facility. Next slide, please. As relates to eligibility, historically eligibility, as you know, was related only to DHS identified UASI regions. That number changes year to year based on DHS's risk assessment process, but eligibility expanded, as you heard prior, in the last two grant cycles with the introduction of the Nonprofit Security S program, which was the non-UASI edition. Based on initial information and guidance, we anticipate the FY21 grant program is going to follow suit, and Rob will talk more specifically about what's anticipated and what's known a bit later on. What we know for certain is that any changes that have been made to UASI regions will follow the release of the Notice of Funding Opportunity in mid to late February. So that'll be important to look at the differences between eligibility inside or outside of a region, depending on where you sit geographically. Last year, we saw $50 million in the UASI program and $40 million for the accompanying NSGPS program, which was significantly increased. For FY21, those program dollars are expected and will be split evenly across both programs. And I know Rob is going to talk more about the funding allocations shortly. Next slide, please. So in FY 2020, this is just a quick slide of going over the UASI regions. Again, year to year, there's sometimes minor changes, sometimes larger changes to this, but largely, in 2020, we had 32 UASI regions outlined on the slide. And it is, like I said, subject to change slightly year over year. The UASI is based on that DHS risk process, which goes into effect each year to determine whether or not there should be changes on inclusion of states and localities based on risk and other identified criteria that DHS uses. So when we see the notice of funding opportunity released, we'll have the opportunity to also look at any updated UASI lists for eligibility, and that'll be published through DHS and FEMA as well. As I mentioned on the prior eligibility slide, regardless of the UASI regions, this will not impact eligibility for qualified nonprofits, but may determine which program an organization would apply to based upon your geographic location, whether inside a UASI region or outside of one. Turn the next slide over to Rob.
So the NSGP program is one of a complement of national grants that support the nation's collective responsibility to prepare and secure the country from foreign and domestic terrorist threats. The investments supported through NSGP are intended to help build a safe and resilient nation by achieving one or more of the following capabilities. As we discussed later in the impact section of the PowerPoint, a sub-applicant will be required to identify at least one of these capabilities that will be built or achieved through their project. This information will be assessed by FEMA to predict or measure the efficacy and likelihood of success of the project request. Failing to clearly identify the applicable capabilities will negatively impact a sub-applicant's score. Next slide, please. Once the funding is sent to FEMA, FEMA will determine which urban areas will be eligible to participate in the urban area program. Only at the end of the award process will participating urban areas learn how FEMA parsed funding between the jurisdictions based on internal assessment of risks. And this year, we understand that they may actually increase the pool of eligible UASI areas based on the fact that we've been able to secure such an increase in additional funding. However, FEMA will set the funding allocations each state will receive under the state initiative at the beginning of the process and will be known within the notice of funding opportunity. FEMA has established a 3-year period of performance, although most projects are generally completed within the first or second years. Additionally, the state or federal reviewers may prefer projects with shorter completion times as they will be scoring the efficiency and efficacy of each program. As we discussed later in the PowerPoint, sub-applicants must set forth their estimated program implementation timelines in the project milestones section of the application. Following general federal grant practices, the NSGP awards are paid out through a reimbursement format as a precaution against misuse of funds. The subgrantees are required to lay out the funding for the approved project investments and activities and submit reimbursement requests that substantiate the outlays to the state administrative agencies. Only permissible uses of the funds that were included in the application and approved in the award notification can be reimbursed. For this year, we expect that the notice of funding opportunity will be announced based on my latest data on or about the last week of February, as opposed to the middle to late February. So think the last week. Once that occurs, the state administrative agencies will have between 45 and 60 days to receive, score, and submit sub-grant applications to FEMA. And within that time frame, the SAAs will establish the grant period to receive sub-grant applications, which can vary by jurisdiction. Michael mentioned 6 to 8 weeks. In certain years, we've seen it 2 to 4 weeks. So that will be established by the state administrative agencies and can be different depending on the jurisdiction. So for us, generally speaking, we tell nonprofits that they will have about 30 days to complete and submit their applications once the application period starts in their community. FEMA will also set the funding caps to in the notice of funding opportunity. The current cap is $100,000 for both the urban area and state programs, although the SAAs, especially under the state program, may set a lower cap in their jurisdiction to increase the total number of applicants they recommend for funding across the state. And this year, as there's considerably more dollars available, it very well may be that FEMA will increase the cap from somewhere above that $100,000 mark, and that also will be established within the notice of funding opportunity. And by law, awards must be announced by midnight, September 30th, but are typically made between mid-August and early September. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, the program can support several categories of permissible costs, including physical target hardening, emergency preparedness planning, training and exercises, and the hiring of contract security personnel. However, the lion's share of the grant supports physical target hardening, consistent with FEMA's position that the program's primary intent is to save lives and to protect property. Target hardening under the program is limited to two categories of physical security equipment and inspection and screening systems set forth in FEMA's approved equipment list. Examples of approved equipment include gates, fences, and bollards, lighting systems, access control systems, video, camera, and surveillance systems, reinforced locks, windows and doors, and more. I warn that navigating the online AEL portal can be a bit challenging and takes some patience. We do walk through navigating the portal in our written guidance, which is available upon request. And we urge you to get up there on the portal and become familiar with it so that there are no surprises during application time. When we review sections 3 and 4 of the investment justification, we will address in greater detail what target hardening entails, as well as the types of training, planning, and exercises that can be utilized under the grant. Next slide, please. All permissible costs to be considered for funding using the NSGP must be included in the sub-applicant's investment justification. If it is not included in the IJ, equipment or activities normally permissible will be disqualified for funding. Additionally, pre-award costs are generally not allowed, such as security investments made prior to the award or costs associated with conducting the risk assessment or completing the investment justification itself. Next slide, please.
So as I mentioned previously, historically, the NSGP was restricted to the previously referenced urban areas under the UASI program. Certainly, as a result of significant advocacy efforts and recognition of the threat and risk environment, more broadly, FEMA expanded that definition and availability and eligibility for the NSGP program by creating the NSGP-S program. So really covered most of this on the prior slides, but really just wanted to distinguish between the two, in the slide. Really what the one major takeaway is, as part of that process, first step is confirming your location to determine eligibility. As some UASI regions and boundaries are pretty clear, depending on the city or state you live in, some do contain areas that we call MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas, which may be a contiguous or part of the UASI region. So it's not always clear, within city limits or suburban areas within a UASI region, where those lines end and where they begin. So it's really important as you're thinking through preparing to apply, that confirming either through FEMA's website or with the SAA that you are able to determine eligibility based on geographic region, which will ultimately determine which grant program you're applying to. Next slide.
The evaluation criteria apply to both urban area and state initiatives. The application is structured to assess how well a sub-applicant meets these requirements. Our written guidance was developed to help satisfy the criteria. For scoring purposes, as we describe later, it is paramount that all sub-applicants make clear that due to their ideology, beliefs, and mission, they are at a high risk of a terrorist attack. If the sub-applicant does not make this case, it will be hard for them to earn enough points to secure a grant award. Additionally, sub-applicants will be evaluated to make sure they have made the correct designation for applying to the correct program initiative, which is based on the sub-applicant's physical address, as Pat alluded to, and whether they have previously received NSGP funding in prior years. We expect that FEMA will continue to apply a certain level of bonus points, most recently 5 points, to the final scores of organizations that have not previously received an NSGP grant award. And this year, I note, given the significant increase in funding, the impact of this 5-point bonus may not be significant at all to repeat applicants. Next slide. To be clear, the state is the applicant and the nonprofit is the sub-applicant. When FEMA releases its notice of funding opportunity for the NSGP program, They are releasing it to the state's designated Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency, referred to in the NOFO as the State Administrative Agency, or SAA. The SAAs are responsible for applying for the grants on behalf of the nonprofit sub-applicants. The sub-applicants will look to their SAAs for all official guidance, instructions, and application materials required of FEMA and the state. They are the sub-applicant's point of contact. In nearly all circumstances, there would be no reason for a nonprofit to engage FEMA directly. That would be a red flag that the nonprofit is not following instructions. It should be noted that the state administrative agencies may operate their NSGP programs somewhat differently from state to state, as FEMA guidelines provide the SAAs with a degree of latitude and discretion in how they proceed. As such, while JFNA and SCN will assist sub-applicants based on the overarching FEMA-provided guidance, the SAA's interpretation and application of the guidelines is what matters most for the sub-applicants in their jurisdictions. For example, while not in FEMA's guidance, some states may require pre-qualification to do business with the state or require sub-applicants to register with the federal contracting system for award management. While not major hurdles to qualify, they must be satisfied and may take time to complete. Under these circumstances, all sub-applicants should carefully review the instructions and requirements posted or provided by their SAA and to rely utmost on the state guidance or any additional details or requirements provided by their SAA. I note that sometimes SAAs do make mistakes in processing FEMA guidance, and SCN and JFNA can be a resource to sub-applicants in those circumstances to facilitate a clarification or a remedy from FEMA. Next slide. The application is called an investment justification, or IJ. There are 7 parts to the investment justification, which we will review in order. Some, but not all of these sections have character limitations, and most, but not all, of the sections will be scored. However, completeness is paramount, as even sections that are not scored specifically will still be evaluated, and the quality and completeness of all responses will impact the final score. Consequently, all sections should be treated with the same level of importance and care, and none should be taken for granted. Next slide, please. The applicant information section focuses on the sub-applicant's general demographics. This seems innocuous enough, but this is not the case. First of all, how a sub-applicant responds to the question on organization type can make the difference between securing a grant or not. In answering this question, it is imperative the sub-applicant makes the connection to the organization's Jewish faith, values, learning, heritage, and life. Additionally, each nonprofit is required to submit a mission statement along with the IJ. And the mission statement should also reflect the organization's Jewish identity, a connection to the Jewish community, and way of life. As you draft your responses, always be thinking about how to articulate how the organization's ideology, beliefs, and mission make them a high risk of a terrorist attack. Also, as mentioned, the physical address question will determine whether the sub-applicant applies under NSGP urban area or NSGP state. A mistake here could also lead to disqualification. With respect to providing a 501c3 number, or EIN, certain organizations such as churches, mosques, and synagogues are automatically exempt and are not required to provide recognition of exemption. They would leave the EIN number blank. However, some SAAs may require exempt organizations to submit an affidavit or other statement affirming tax exempt status. Next slide, please. There are 2 parts to the background section. In the first part, the sub-applicant should make the case that the type of organization it is and its role and place in the community make it a likely target of a threat. This could be exemplified by its membership, mission statement, services offered, population served, curriculum, programs, or services offered, or its symbolic value in the community. For example, for more than 100 years, the Federation continues to be recognized in the community as the central body for raising funds helping to coordinate programs and services to strengthen Jewish life, experience, and meaning, and providing a safety net for the most vulnerable in our community. In the second part, the sub-applicant must explain any role it has in responding to or recovering from a terrorist attack. Many sub-applicants struggle to answer this part because they do not see themselves in a responder role. Another example, the Federation is a member of JVOAD, or Jewish Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, and raises funds to respond to man-made and natural disasters, such as providing relief from hurricanes, fires, and earthquakes, and responding to devastating attacks, as it did after 9/11, the Tree of Life, Poway, Jersey City, and Muncie mass casualty attacks as well. Often in a crisis, the Federation opens its doors and services to first responders, serving as a central meeting point for responders and providing them with respite care they need to successfully do their jobs. Our written guidance provides recommendations on how to respond to these questions. Next slide, please. While we all feel the existential threat, NSGP is a risk-based program. In making decisions, the determination of risk is a central factor in how the SAAs and FEMA will rank and prioritize the applications they review. Therefore, each sub-applicant is required to conduct a vulnerability risk assessment, which serves as a framework for them to identify risks and weaknesses and determine and prioritize the resources they seek through the grant to address their most critical security needs. The risk section of the IJ has three parts that address the specific or relative threats to the sub-applicant, identify the vulnerabilities or weaknesses in their physical security or the gaps in emergency preparedness planning or training they need, and describe the consequences or impact a terrorist threat would have on the sub-applicant, its staff, volunteers, constituents, and community. A good vulnerability risk assessment will identify any specific record of threat or general but relevant threat occurrence that relate to the sub-applicant and will spell out the specific protective measures required or recommended, whether target hardening, planning, training, exercises, or contracted security personnel, that would most efficiently and effectively counter the risks, minimize the vulnerabilities, and mitigate the potential consequences of the attack. A quality vulnerability risk assessment will also help to identify and satisfy key measurements of success in the impact section of the IJ, as we discuss later. Whatever the quality of the vulnerability risk assessment is, the sub-applicant must address these questions as best they can, and the materials we provide are intended to help in that way. We delve further into the vulnerability risk assessment in subsequent slides. Next slide.
Thanks, Rob. Really just want to kind of cover vulnerability risk assessments a little further, then we'll get into the kind of physical security component of the application, the IJ. So first and foremost, as Rob mentioned, this is a critical step in its requirement. That assessment establishing your initial baseline of security, what your vulnerabilities look like, any gaps will inform and must directly tie into your investment justification and those equipment requests that are tied to the AEL. Following the December 17th webinar, SCN released an updated self-assessment tool, which is also accessible through our NSGP webpage on the SCN website. We also encourage organizations, just given if you've not already got your assessment done in the past year, to really work with qualified providers, whether that's your community security director through your federation, an SCN regional security advisor, law enforcement partners, or other qualified professionals to assist you in completing that vulnerability assessment. We recognize over the past year and going forward, it's been difficult in a COVID restricted environment, but part of the distribution of that self-assessment tool was to help folks kind of work through that process. In addition, there's other tools that have been recently announced. Our DHS partners at CISA released the Houses of Worship Vulnerability Assessment Guide, which is also a great tool and resource if you're looking for another opportunity to do that. In the coming week, to kind of further enhance the self-assessment tool that we issued in December, SCN is going to release a new version of the tool, which more closely aligns with the authorized equipment list and items in an effort to better assist organizations with identifying those gaps and vulnerabilities through that initial assessment, developing a risk score, and inclusive of of drop downs, which will allow you to pick and choose with consultation from SCN or other partners, an ability to align and comport with some of the FEMA AEL requirements. This tool and process will assist applicants, with the ability to more closely align their assessment with their investment justification, which you heard Rob talk about extensively, and remove some of that guesswork. And of course, as Michael mentioned at the outset, as we ramp up resourcing and staffing and dedicated time and focus to this effort, SCN will be available to provide additional guidance and assistance, both with this tool and also the process. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, section 4 that Rob outlined in his previous slides, covers target hardening, planning, and training, largely around physical security improvements. So in this next series of slides, I want to cover target hardening, physical improvements, planning, training, and exercises. Of course, as we mentioned repeatedly, the primary goal, initial goal is target hardening, that identification and installation of physical security equipment and protective measures, as well as planning and training related to same. Physical security enhancements could be something as simple as a reinforced door, which we know repelled the terrorist attack in Halle, Germany, window film, CCTV cameras, advanced access control, and intrusion detection systems, just to name a few. Equipment must, 1, address and mitigate and correct vulnerability identified in your assessment, and 2, be on the FEMA's authorized assessment list, which Rob talked about in the prior slide. This list consists of several categories, divided into subcategories and then individual equipment items. Just want to reinforce Rob's suggestion and guidance to really study and understand that list prior. It is a government document. It takes a little getting used to interpret that, but really it will help you kind of think through what specific items and numbers kind of align with, the recommendations coming out of your vulnerability assessment. So really, while there's broad categories, for the purposes of the NSGP application and process, we mainly focus on those 2 relevant equipment categories, which Rob previewed, 14 and 15, which cover physical security enhancements and inspection and screening systems broadly. Again, as always, please consult with your SAA on any specific questions or any clarification, or if you're unsure whether or not something qualifies as an allowable cost. Next slide, please. So if we shift a little bit to, planning still under target hardening, we really encourage facilities and community use of funds for security preparedness planning. The goal of creating and establishing that holistic community security program, not just within your facility, but again, as I mentioned earlier, how you tie into a broader, whole community approach as FEMA describes. So again, developing some of those SOPs that you may be lacking, emergency action plans, evacuation planning, shelter in place, and any other gaps in policy and procedure that could further support your security program. And this also includes particularly, when you're introducing new equipment based on your assessment and in your investment justification, ensuring that any preparedness planning and training around the introduction of that new equipment or security measures is factored in as well. I know Rob just issued that in recent guidance. That's critically important that staff and personnel are trained on new equipment and other policies, procedures, or otherwise that's introduced to this grant program. And that's another component that should be focused on when you're thinking about the grant application process, and ensuring that it's all detailed and articulated in your investment justification. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, training, obviously training has been and will always remain a huge priority for SCN. Challenge in the COVID environment, we still managed to train over 12,000 people this year, through the portfolio of training that we offer both nationally and regionally. So there's a real opportunity to, take that into next year when you're thinking about that broader security plan, including training, as an allowable cost within your application. Training conducting using NSGP funds must address a specific threat and or vulnerability as identified in your organizational investment justification. This may include safety and security training related to facility operations and equipment, such as active shooter, active threat, or stop the bleed, which many of you have participated in this past year. And also includes allowable training materials and equipment, training kits, training tourniquets that are made available for stop the bleed training that may qualify as well as part of your IJ if articulated as required need to address a gap or mitigate a vulnerability, through that assessment process and planning. Next slide, please. Again, a little bit more detail on training. Some of the training that SCN and some of our partners offer to consider as you're thinking through this. As Dina mentioned at the outset, we are updating our SCN services guide, which outlines the portfolio of training, tabletop exercises, thinking about full-scale exercises and drills that many of our Federation partners have done with law enforcement over the past several years, are things that can be considered and thought about when you're thinking about your investment justification and asks within the security grant program. That guide will outline some of the training to the best of our ability, doing some market research, provide some cost estimates. Again, really just to help you think through as you're getting estimates for some of the other equipments and training, what that looks like in terms of dollar figures when you're thinking about a total bottom line investment justification and application. Next slide, please. Again, related to training, exercises are critically important and another allowable cost under the program. As many of you have participated either physically or virtually, SCN has conducted tabletop exercises with our federal partners over the past several years and continues to support the development of those programs at the state and local levels, to include many of our Federation partners where we've had the opportunity to do that as well. One of the other things I'll note is a lot of other law enforcement related grants also are eligible for training. So beyond the grant itself, thinking about and having conversations with your law enforcement, public safety, EMS partners is a great thing to do in advance of your grant application process, to look at opportunities for joint training that may go into your application. And there's no better offering than, a Jewish organization that's put in joint exercises and training through their grant application and be able to bring law enforcement partners to the table through an application and through a grant for training that is paid for and provided, through the NSGP. So something to think about and consider to further establish those law enforcement partnerships. Next slide, please.
The ability to contract security personnel or off-duty police is a relatively new permissible cost. The funding may not be used to underwrite existing security contracts and may not be used to purchase equipment or contracted security personnel. The guidance in FY 2020 required the sub-applicants to submit a plan that explains how contracted security personnel costs will be sustained after the funding or period of performance of the award expires, suggesting that in the absence of sustained capabilities, this may not be considered by the SAA to be a good investment of limited resources. We expect that contracted security personnel will be continued eligible costs this year. I note that this is not a typically funded investment under the FEMA emergency preparedness grant programs. It is possible that FEMA could further tighten the requirements for contracted security personnel in the upcoming NOFO. Anyone interested in pursuing this investment should seek specific guidance from their SAA. Next slide, please. The project milestone questions go to competency. The SAAs and FEMA want to have confidence in the sub-applicant's understanding of the scope and nature of their project and that the project can be completed within the 36-month period of performance. Milestones may include the hiring of vendors, ordering, acquiring, and installing equipment, planning, scheduling, and carrying out training, submitting FEMA's required administration, paperwork, and so forth. As I mentioned previously, a long and drawn-out process that sets forth unusual, incomplete, or unrealistic details, timelines, or outcomes may raise red flags and lose points during the review process. I note our written guidance provides a sample sequence of possible milestones from program start to finish, with which sub-applicants can draw from. Next slide, please. The project management section also serves as a confidence builder in the review process. It shows that the sub-applicant has a management plan worked out, has assigned responsibilities to competent people, has thought through the process, and identified any potential challenges it might have to address or resolve during a project's implementation. This section also importantly provides an opportunity for the sub-applicant to highlight how the grant opportunity will promote coordination and collaboration with state and local law enforcement or other public partners such as first responders and hospitals. By way of illustration, a sub-applicant may have a local law enforcement conduct the sub-applicant's vulnerability risk assessment, have local law enforcement lead or participate in preparedness training or tabletop exercises, provide some role for local law enforcement in program review, particularly with respect to any investments they may have recommended in the assessment, or invite law enforcement to make suggestions on how they might engage the organization going forward and incorporate those suggestions into its management plans. No matter what, it is highly recommended that sub-applicants figure out a way to integrate law enforcement, first responder assets into the framework of project planning and management, as well as possible activities or opportunities to build a lasting relationship with them. Next slide, please. In the impact section, the sub-applicant is required to address two questions. First, they are asked to explain the expected measurable outputs and outcomes resulting from the completion of the project that would best illustrate the success of the project. Here, the response should include a self-assessment statement on how, in practice, the target hardening investments acquired through the grant, as set forth in parts 4 of the IJ, most efficiently and effectively reduce the risks and vulnerabilities identified in the risk section of the application in part 3, and thus protect against the consequences of a potential terrorist attack. Second, they are asked to describe the security and resiliency improvements that will be achieved through the grant. This section will help FEMA assess the contributions the sub-applicant will make to the nation's collective national preparedness goals through the proposed project. To do this, sub-applicants are required to describe how specific project investments build or achieve one or more of FEMA's designated core capabilities. Core capabilities fall under one of 5 mission areas: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. By way of example of achieving a prevention capability, the vulnerability risk assessment found that the day school was vulnerable to an intruder because it has multiple unsecured entry points and no access controls. It is vulnerable to an intrusion that could place the lives of the students, faculty, and visitors at risk of an active shooter incident. Other schools have previously been targeted by active shooters. This could lead to multiple casualties, including loss of life. It is possible that the school would not be able to recover and remain open to serve the community if such an incident were to occur. Through the acquisition and installation of an access control system and creating a single point of entry through the grant, the school will be able to prevent a possible active shooter attack. This is another section where sub-applicants lose points because they get confused by the core capabilities concept. Further explanation and illustrations on answering the core capabilities question can be found in our written guidance. Next slide. The grant is highly competitive. Therefore, a sub-applicant should never leave an open question. Partial answers are better than no answers, and our written guidance is intended to help prompt answers. Additionally, sub-applicants must be especially careful to answer the questions in the sections where they are asked. The right answer placed in the wrong section will earn 0 points. Also, while there is a maximum raw score of 40 points that can be earned, the final score will be calculated by additional factors, including the sub-applicant's organizational type and whether they have previously received a grant. For example, a day school applicant that illustrates that it is at high risk of a terror attack due to its ideology, beliefs, and mission will have its raw score multiplied by a factor of 3, tripling its final score. Whereas a day school that simply describes itself as an educational institution could have its raw score multiplied by a factor of 2, only doubling its final score. By way of illustration, as we know, a Jewish day school is not simply a school. It may include religious services and Jewish learning. It may be pro-Israel. It may fly the Israeli flag alongside the American flag. Its mission may state it as pro-Zionist. The school's name and signage may identify it as Jewish. It may open its doors to the community to host Jewish holidays or cultural activities. These characteristics would make a school at high risk for a terrorist attack because of its ideology, beliefs, and mission. Each sub-applicant must do its best to make this point based on their particulars. Additionally, with high demand and limited resources, we expect FEMA will continue to the practice of adding some level of bonus points in the final score. And as we mentioned previously, it has been a 5-point bonus in recent years. And depending on how FEMA decides it will distribute the funding this year, it may change the level of the bonus point structure, and we'll include that in our updates in the near future, as well as we will if there are any changes to the AEL list that we'll know about after the NOFO is reported. Next slide.
So what should we be doing now? Michael indicated this is a year-round process, but lo and behold, we're at the beginning of grant season, as we fondly or affectionately call it. Really, there's a couple things that you can and should be doing now if you've not already done that. So consider this a pre-application checklist in addition to the guidance Rob has already submitted today. Really thinking through and assembling that key stakeholder group, whether that's folks internally organization, externally, facilities, finance, everybody involved in the process to ensure that everybody is on standby, everybody is contributing to the conversation, and we're thinking through this in a multidisciplinary way. As you mentioned several times, contacting your SAA for any specific grant requirements or information, whether that's shortened deadlines determined at the state level, whether that is nuances in state level business registration requirements, or anything else that might be specific to your state, which goes into that third point there. We covered at length conducting that facility vulnerability assessment. That is a requirement. If one has been done in the past year, that is fine. There's no real hard and fast requirements. We just, rule of thumb is to ensure it's current and that major changes and updates haven't been done to your facility, or obviously something that's several years old is probably a good idea to update that and ensure a current assessment is done for your facility. As Rob mentioned and ran through, and we will do in future workshops, really running through in detail the various sections of the FY 2020 investment justification, which is the last year of funding and the closest application process that we can go off of until the NOFO is released in the end of February. While we don't anticipate changes, it's important to look for those changes and any additional requirements as the application is certainly critical at that juncture. Now is a good time to compile and research any relevant risk, threat, incident data. Have there been any impacts to your facility in the past year? Any nearby? Looking at some of the ADL information, what Rob's put out, what SCN puts out, and really being selective in identifying threats or risks to like type Jewish facilities if you have not had anything directly impacting yours, to really paint that risk and threat picture more broadly as it relates to the Jewish community. Again, exploring and reviewing that AEL, familiarizing yourself not just with the format and looking how to read that document, but really understanding what is allowable when you're looking at your risk assessment and trying to marry up those vulnerabilities with protective measures and solutions to fill those gaps. And then lastly, really identifying vendors and security solutions providers that can review your risk and vulnerability assessment and really offer any preliminary scope of work, project estimates, and related costs when you think through, building that scope of work and contributing to that grant application as far as a cost request is going to look like. Next slide, please. And then lastly, just want to add to Rob's project management slide, and just a few final thoughts and considerations for a successful project. Obviously, the period of performance is 3 years. It sounds like a long time, but considering some of the complexities of projects when it comes to permits, when it comes to construction, when it comes to things such as conservation easements or historical studies, it really is important to look at the totality of the project, period of performance, and any obstacles seen or unseen that may contribute to a protracted grant performance period. We've seen this not often, but there are documented cases where we've had organizations go through the arduous process of getting a grant, being awarded a grant, and then not being able to spend that money, running into issues that I just mentioned. So think through that, prioritize that. Certainly depending on what level of work that you've done, your projects or priorities may actually exceed grant funding. So really thinking through, prioritizing your approach to the request, not only is what is most critical, but it's also what is most feasible. You've heard me mention in the past, complex projects like trying to get a bollard installed on a city sidewalk, may not be something that is successful, even though it might be something that's critical. So thinking through, alternatives or just some of those potential pitfalls in major capital projects and planning as you move forward. Next slide, please. Want to just put the contact information up for both of our partners here, SCN's Duty Desk and also Rob's office in DC. Rob maintains a comprehensive distro list that continues to provide updates and guidance, and SCN will continue to push out information following this webinar and our next series of webinars. Next slide, please. So we have a few minutes left for Q&A before we close out on a couple items. So I'll just ask my team to be on standby, and I will pull up the questions, and we will go through that in a moderated way, and I will put some of those questions to Rob, Michael, and the team in a as organized process as possible. I do want to thank the team for answering questions throughout. As you can imagine, questions are plentiful, and the team managed to answer 68 of them throughout the course of the webinar. So I appreciate the questions. So first, I'll just start with the top. We didn't really talk about this much, but I know depending on your risk assessment and vulnerabilities, it is an option. Rob or Michael, can you talk about the allowability for the grant for cybersecurity areas and issues?
Sure. Cybersecurity is a permissible cost under the program, but it is not considered a priority cost. It falls below the physical security investments, which is the primary objective of this program. I have asked FEMA to include in their upcoming NOFO more clarification. If they're going to make it eligible, what do they mean by eligible? And to provide a little bit more guidance as people are thinking about potentially seeking those investments in their application. So I would suggest that if it is listed as a top security in your risk assessment, a top vulnerability in your risk assessment, then it makes sense to apply for it. If it's not considered one of the top vulnerabilities to address for this program, it may be something that FEMA or the state administration agency may not support.
Thanks, Rob. You and I chatted briefly before the webinar. Well, we know officially FEMA and DHS has not released the guidance, that there has been some activity at state levels. Can you just, there had been some questions and confusion about that as some states are pushing out information. Can you just comment on that and just kind of set the record straight on where people should be looking and listening?
Absolutely. Some of the states are learning from us that there's a huge benefit for the preliminary preparedness for this grant, given how short the time frame it is once the official application timeline begins. I believe today, Texas and Colorado administrative agencies or government entity have put out preliminary guidance to their fields or posted guidance on their portals. We recommend that all people on the call and all potentially interested participants to get on their SAA's websites and figure out whether, to familiarize themselves where information regarding this grant will be posted. And in some cases, as in the case of Texas and Colorado, there may be new information up there. After this call, through my distribution list as well as scans, I think we should make available FEMA's link to the state administration agencies staff locator, so that folks that aren't familiar with their state administrative agencies can get that important contact information and get going and making those connections.
Thank you. A couple questions around radios and communication equipment. Can you, decipher that between the AELs, whether they're still allowed, not allowed, two-way radios and related equipment?
Sure. I'm not familiar with two-way radios ever being a permissible cost for the nonprofit security grant program, but in past years, the ability to acquire and install warning systems was permissible, like long-range hailing systems. and then became impermissible. But I know that a number of camps and schools have been seeking the reinstatement of these hailing equipment as a permissible cost for the nonprofit grant program. And I know FEMA is considering it, and we'll know whether or not that will be reinstated once the notice of funding opportunity is released.
Thanks, Rob. Let me just see next here.
Yeah, while you tee up the next question, I can, if you, first of all, for everyone that's asked, we are going to make the recording and materials available to everybody. They'll be sent out to all the participants afterwards, because that's a prevailing question. And then there are several questions on the assessments, and I'll invite Rob to jump in on this. Some of it relates to the requirements around the assessment. The assessment criteria in the grant application is very, very broad. So it does not necessarily require an assessment completed by a law enforcement agency, by a protective security advisor, or by a security professional, although it has been our experience that assessments completed by those groups, to include and specifically individuals that have familiarity with our community, Jewish community security directors, regional security advisors, and certainly many of our law enforcement partners fare very well. Similarly, we have seen private vendors that run the gamut, and some are very good, and many are very, very expensive and of less quality. So it's always important to be very attentive to that. And that's why we encourage a long lead time on this process in order to get started. But the assessment tools up on the website are able to be used, as is CISA's House of Worship self-assessment tool.
I would just add quickly that there is no specific criteria for a risk assessment by FEMA or the SAAs. I can tell you that SCN's self-assessment tools, and there are others that are highly touted as competent and should be used. We certainly, particularly with communities that have community or regional security directors or advisors, many of them under the leadership or connected to SCN, are very qualified to assist communities conduct risk assessments and advise on risk assessments. And my experience in speaking with the state administrative agencies, they rely on self-assessments and make decisions equally on those as they do those that may be from vendors or private sector. And there's no disadvantage, generally speaking, if you were relying on a self-assessment.
There's a good technical question, Rob, Michael, I know you both could probably answer this. When it comes to thinking through service providers, whether or not normal federal government requirements for competition, i.e. bids and things like that, come into play when you're looking at products or services that are applicable to the grant process.
And generally speaking, there's nothing in the notice of funding opportunity on the requirement of bids. We just advise best practice. If you want quality vendors, you want quality products, and you want not to be fleeced, you need to know what the environment is in your community. What's the going rate? And FEMA and the SAAs will sniff out right away if there's a cost or a request that doesn't really meet industry standards. So just be smart about it. Efficiency, efficacy are things that they look to, and things that are out of the ordinary or raise an eyebrow will raise their eyebrows.
Thanks, Rob. If you could talk a little bit about funding amounts. There's a couple of questions around that, whether or not it's all or nothing, except either they accept all of our requests or just a portion. I know we've covered this in past webinars, but for this group, you can just talk about what that looks like.
Sure. And I think we alluded to it in our FAQ. And by the way, we will be incorporating questions that come up on this call in the chat or otherwise in our FAQ, so that everybody will have their questions answered, even if we run out of time, in this session. What was the question?
It was around funding amounts, whether or not is it all or nothing, partial funding.
So people should apply for what they need. If what is determined is a budget of 100,000, if that is the cap, then that's what they should apply for. Generally speaking, under the Urban Area Security Initiative, applicants get what they apply for. With the newer state initiative, which I mentioned, the states will get basically a block grant. Each state will be allocated a set amount of funding. In the last year, the lowest amount was 300,000 and the highest amount was 1.8 million. SAAs that are making decisions about the state requirement may determine that based on the number of applicants they receive, that they will set a cap lower than what you ask for in order to fund or approve, optimize the number of applicants that they may award. So folks in communities that are applying under the state initiative may want to consider in their planning that if they're asked to, or if they're granted an award less than what they asked for, that they're prepared to pivot and reconsider their thinking about how they're going to move forward, if that makes sense.
Pat, can I address one logistical issue that came up in several of the questions over the course of the webinar? There have been several questions about the time it takes to fill out the grant. This varies wildly, and some of it depends a great deal on the individual state requirements. There are 50 separate processes and more when we add in Puerto Rico and other locations. One thing that we would stress to people, the upload process can also vary widely. So please do not wait until the last day or the last minute. There have been frequent issues with the uploading of the applications. Just like turning in a final exam, try to get it done early. And we recommend at least 24 hours early so that if there's any issue uploading the application, you have ample time to alert the SAA and to work with them to get the application uploaded or find a contingency plan.
Also, the application is Excel-based, which I believe is Microsoft software. Folks that are working on Apple-based computers, I advise you strongly not to, and that instead to find an alternative, and even if you had to purchase an inexpensive Dell or something to that effect, because there have been nightmare problems with folks that were utilizing Apple hardware and had lost their files or had significant problems with uploading to the SAA's portal.
Thanks, Rob. I think we have time for one more question, then I want to turn it over to Michael and Harold to close us out. Just grouping a couple here together. Rob and or Michael, can you talk a little bit about allowable costs, limits when it comes to either construction costs as part of installation, structural engineering, some of those required costs for protective measures and mitigation, but obviously not the equipment.
Michael, quickly, I would say if folks are contemplating construction, there will be prerequisites to that, meaning pre-award approval requirements, probably on the application side. So you should probably reach out to me directly to talk a little bit more about that, and we can get into the nuances. But construction will probably require a very involved written submission to the SAA, and with their approval, then forwarding that request to FEMA for their review. And there is written guidance on that from FEMA, and I'm happy to make that available to whoever is having, thinking about construction and what that means.
Thanks, Rob. With that, I'm just going to pause on questions as we've done in the past. We will be sure to go through all the open questions. We've been able to answer 77 between the Q&A and the chat. We will provide, as a follow-up to the recording, the slide deck, the audio recording, and also Rob and the team will work through answering any final questions that remain and put those in a Q&A document that are sent out and also made available through multiple channels. So with that, Rob, thank you. I will turn it over to Michael and Harold to close us out.
Thanks, Pat. And I just want to thank Rob again and Keith. The partnership that occurs between local communities and JFNA and SCN is really, I think, the best of our system coming together on behalf of the whole community. And it's a pleasure to work together. And want to thank Rob for answering almost every email that he gets over the coming months. So, and we're working to increase that support together collectively as a system between JFNA and SCN. Before I turn it over to Harold Gernsbacher, the board chair of SCN and the treasurer of JFNA, I just want to highlight the importance of reporting. And certainly in these times, we would ask everyone as a reminder to please, if you see something, say something, do something. Call local law enforcement or your local relevant suspicious activity reporting authority. If you have a local Jewish community security director or regional security advisor, contact them. And then please let the duty desk know, particularly if you don't have a local security director, so that we can work with you and work with law enforcement. We've seen an incredible uptick in issues and incidents over the last several years. And we want to make sure our whole community is protected. And leading that charge to make sure that we're in a position to do so on behalf of SCN and our entire system as well as community, it's my pleasure to introduce Harold Gernsbacher. Sir.
Good afternoon. I firstly want to thank our professional leadership, Mike Masters, Patrick Daly, thank you as always, and Rob Goldberg, who lives and breathes this 365, 724. I know it's supposed to be 6, but it's 7. And also Alana Breutman, who runs the Washington office of JFNA. Keith Libman, my partner in lots of things. We find crossroads where we work together on a regular basis. This is a very important time for our community. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, hate crime incidences in churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples increased by roughly 35% between 2014 and 2018. According to the FBI, 2019 saw the highest number of hate crimes since 2008. Over 60% of religiously motivated hate crimes were targeted at Jews, a 14% increase from the year before. In September 2019, the Department of Homeland Security warned that the faith-based community, particularly the Jewish community, were threatened by domestic terrorists. 1 year later, while facing unprecedented challenges in our community and organizations from COVID-1, the threat unfortunately remains more strongly than ever. These funds were created through the hard work of our federation system, with JFNA leading the way with our key partners and SCN pulling at the process every single day. The process by which we are working today creates an obligation. It creates an obligation on us, the community. That obligation is to make applications, work to receive these funds, and enhance the physical security of our communities and protect ourselves as best we very can. We need to ensure that every organization, urban and rural, large and small, can apply and use these funds. Please take advantage of the information presented today. Take advantage of the information and the resources that you have. If you have a question, send an email, make a call. We will do our best to answer it and support you. The planning, training, and physical security that these funds can provide can literally and do literally save lives. There is just not an excuse for us not to go after these grants and to work them within our community. As we know, the obligation to save a life is the greatest single obligation that we have. You can help achieve this with a 6-page grant application. Not an easy one, but it is only 6 pages. Our federation system will and scan the official safety and security organization of our community. We are here. We are here to help you do the work. We're here to support you. We're here to help you keep your community safe. I cannot thank you enough for your time and your attention in being here today. Please reach out to us. We're happy to try and reach out to you, and we are available for you. Again, thank you for the time and the consideration today.